I'm Alamin Abdul-Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. You might know the director Robert Lepage for being one of the giants of Quebec's theater scene, but what you might not know is that he is a giant wrestling fan. And when I say giant, I mean the kind of fan who holds underground wrestling matches at his very own theater in Quebec City. Now he's taking his passion a step further. He's got an exhibit at the Museum of Civilization in Quebec about the history of wrestling in that province. It's a show called Slam that he created with the circus company Flip Fabrique. Dominic Tardif is a reporter with Presse. He's seen the show and the exhibit, and he spent a day talking with Robert Lepage. Here's our conversation. Dominique, welcome to the show, buddy. How's it going?
Great. I'm glad to be able to talk about wrestling with you.
Well, listen, I don't get enough people talking to me about wrestling enough, so I'm happy that you're here. I mean, look, you're not like a completely objective journalist who's like, oh, I don't know what's happening here, because you have some investment in this world. You started watching wrestling when you were 4 years old, so this must have been quite the interesting assignment for you to get.
Totally, like objectivity went right out of the window when I was asked to go to Quebec City to meet with Robert Lepage. Because yes, I've been a wrestling fan for many, many years since I was like 4 years old.
Yeah.
I totally fell in love with it. It was a huge part of my childhood. Went away for a while when I became an adult because I was so self-serious and I thought that like wrestling was not smart enough, not serious enough for
we all
me.
go through that stage where we go like,
Yes.
I'm a more serious adult now. I don't watch that wrestling stuff. Yes.
Exactly. But I came back to it. And now, I mean, it's not like I'm watching every hour of wrestling that is being shown on TV every week, because there's a lot of wrestling happening. Just if we're just talking about the WWE world, it's like maybe 6 or 7 hours every week.
It's quite a commitment. Yeah.
It's quite the commitment, but I'm still really into it. And it taps into some part of like when I talk about wrestling, and you're going to hear it for the minutes during our conversation, I'm becoming a child again. So this is why it's so important to me, because it's important to still be tied to the children you were, I think.
That's what I get out of wrestling. You know, narratives that are as old as time of good versus evil. There's drama here that is like kind of core to childhood. And I think like if you're able to connect with that, then you get a lot out of the show. It looks like opera and theater, but also with bodies hitting each other. You know, like that's the thing that I get out of wrestling. Let's talk about the bunch of time that you spent with Lepage. When we describe him as a wrestling fan, how deep is his relationship with wrestling?
So he fell in love with wrestling after meeting a wrestler called Marco Estrada, who's really important for the wrestling community in Quebec City. So they were training at the same gym, and Robert Lepage tells how he was kind of scared of the man because he's got a bunch of muscles, like he's really imposing man. And at some point, Marco Estrada asked Robert Lepage if he wanted to come to a wrestling gala. But Robert Lepage knew wrestling through his childhood, because like in the 60s, 70s in Quebec, wrestling was huge. Went there, totally fell in love with it. You can scream as much as you want during a wrestling gala, during a wrestling. They're asking you to do it. This is how you have.
This is how you have fun. This is how you participate in this thing. Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. So he fell in love with that aspect, the participating aspect of wrestling, because this is how it was going at the theater back in the days. So before they built the fourth wall, is asking you to stay silent during a play. People were screaming at the actors on stage like we do now when we go to a wrestling event. So this is the part he fell in love with at first. And like you were saying earlier, he's starting hosting wrestling gala at his own theater hall, Le Diamant, which is like the nicest theater hall you've seen in your whole life. It's really beautiful, but they will do wrestling event there. And it's also a way for Robert Lepage to bring people from different social classes that would not come
to the theater usually.
Yeah. So they come there to watch wrestling, and maybe they'll come back for another event, a theater event. And they also have, this is like really funny thing, like they have this huge grand piano in the hall covered with gold. So Robert Lepage was like, people are going to put their beers on there during the wrestling event. I don't want that. So the idea he had to prevent that thing happening is to hire a piano player, and the piano player is wearing like the all classical piano player outfit.
Yeah.
But he's playing Metallica songs and rock songs on the grand piano before the wrestling event. So
first of all,
tells you a lot about how he looks at those kind of events and he looks at wrestling.
That's a great solution. And that's how you figure that out. But also just the idea of like, here's like this fanciest theater in town. But then also every once in a while is going to play host to what you call a gala. A gala is, I'm gathering, just like a match, right? Like sort of like an opportunity to sort of invite people to just like watch a match. You've called the exhibit this brilliant meditation on the role of wrestling in society and on the theatrical aspect of wrestling. When you say that, how so?
The exhibit tells the story of wrestling in Quebec.
Yeah.
So it starts at the end of the 19th century. When we get into the exhibit, we're in a barn, because this is how wrestling was born. And this is why the vocabulary we use to talk about wrestling, kayfabe, a baby face, a heel, that vocabulary is tied to the carny world, the carnival world.
Unfortunately, Dominic, what you've just done is made me do the job of having to explain to people what a kayfabe is. Kayfabe is
go ahead. I mean,
is the illusion of reality that you're watching when you're watching wrestling. You're sort of like these are the events that they're asking you to accept as real, because we know it's scripted, but also when you enter into this universe, like this is the general setup. A baby face, that's a hero, like that's the one that everybody's going to cheer for. What I didn't know though is the thing that you just said, which is the idea that this all kind of comes from the language of what were you talking about just now? Carnivals?
About the carnival world.
I didn't know that.
They would have strongman event, and they would ask like, is there a man in this town that is stronger than this man? To prevent the strongman being beaten by some men that could be stronger than him in that very town, they would fix those events. And this is how wrestling was born, through those kinds of contests.
Didn't even know that. Cool.
But Robert Lepage, he uses a lot of mirrors in the exhibit in different ways. But the way I was reading it, I was looking at it like he was trying to tell us that sometimes, but in many cases, wrestlers are able to embody a truer version of themselves when they get into the ring. So like Ric Flair, who said many times that he doesn't really know now who's the real man and who's the character he becomes when he gets into the ring. What
I like about this is that like he is sort of drawing out, or is making you think about the fact that this is really about performance, right? Because the thing that we see most often when we think about wrestling is like maybe the body blows, or maybe the sort of the theatrical way of speaking. But from the way that you're describing this exhibit, he's sort of reminding you, this is a performance, and in order for the performance to land, the performers have to be good at it, And in theater, these are actors whose job it is to sort of dissolve this illusion, between you being like, oh, you're staying in your seat and you're watching these actors. You forget that. You're like, oh, no, these people are really about to have a fight over these ideas. For Lepage, what makes a great wrestling match, would you say?
So I asked him this question, and of course he talks about all the physical aspect of wrestling, of course, because it's always mesmerizing to see those guys, those women and men do flips and all those crazy things in the ring. But the main thing for Robert Lepage that makes a great match is a great story. I mean, it's simple, but it's important. When you watch a great wrestling match, you suddenly forget that it's a put on, that you're watching a performance. You get into it and you pick your side, and you want your guy to win the match. We often say that in wrestling, the main character is the audience, which is true. But for Robert Lepage, the main character is the referee, because he embodies justice. Yeah. And this is one of the things that we see in wrestling. We see a reflection of how justice happens in our world. And most of the time, in wrestling, the referee is corrupt or he's kind of blind he's oblivious to what's really happening in the ring. And I'm quoting Robert Lepage here. Yeah. This is how justice works also in our society. Yeah. Justice is oblivious to the real injustice in the world.
I'm really glad you brought up that point about the referee and the hopes of justice that we keep projecting onto them, knowing that they don't necessarily fulfill that, which leads me to this next conversation, because there's a room in the exhibit that is dedicated to the Montreal Screwjob.
Yes.
Look at this. Oh, you're kidding me. Marcus, are you going to try to beat Bret Hart with a sharpshooter? Yes, he is. Are you kidding me?
My mouth is agape once more.
Are you kidding me?
We got to talk about the Montreal Screwjob, but also, as you were about to say that, you revealed that you're currently wearing a Shawn Michaels shirt. Look, I think we got to talk about this particular moment in wrestling history. Could you explain what the Montreal Screwjob is and why it deserves its own room at this exhibit?
That's kind of a tough assignment for you to ask me to tell how that, like...
Bret the Hitman Hart was supposed to... Yes, you go ahead.
Canadian hero from Calgary was supposed... So he was told before the match that was happening in Montreal, Survivor Series 1997, November. He was told that he was supposed to win the match. He was the champion at that point.
Yes.
He was told he was going to win the match against his archenemy, Shawn Michaels.
The Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels.
A narcissist, where Bret Hart is like this man of...
He's a man of the people. He's our
the man
guy.
of the people. Yeah. And he's got values, and they're important to him. And wrestling is really important to him.
Yeah.
And he was robbed.
They fixed the match, Dominique. They fixed the match, and they screwed Bret the Hitman Hart out of it. So let's talk about the role, though, of why that deserves its own room in this exhibit.
When that thing happened, it kind of shattered in 1 second. It shattered the fourth wall, because Vince McMahon came, the ex-owner of WWE, came at the ring, and Bret Hart spat in his face, and everybody wrote about that event in the wrestling community. Yes. And after that, WWE had no choice but to admit in many ways that it was fixed. And this is how we were talking about kayfabe. This is how kayfabe died. So now, if you're like 4 or 5 years old and you go to a wrestling event, maybe you buy into
into the storytelling being told. Yes. Yeah.
But people are asking wrestling fans, like, but you know that it's fake, and we hate that. Don't use the F word in front of a wrestling fan.
We know. We're here for entertainment. Get out of here. You know what I mean?
We know, but we know it, and it plays into the pleasure, the fun that we have at the event. So there's part of my brain that totally knows it. Like when I go to the movies or when I go to the theater, I'm not constantly telling myself, those guys are going to have a beer after like kissing or hitting each other on stage. Now, it will not be like the best way to enjoy what I'm seeing on stage. So that's the same thing.
It would actively ruin it for you if you're like, they're not really driving those cars in the Fast and the Furious movies. I would like to believe that they are. Like, please leave me alone. This is a part of the entertainment that I get out of this thing.
So you have to suspend disbelief. But now in wrestling, in modern wrestling, they always play with the line.
That's right. They write that into the show so they can no longer distinguish what is real and what is not. And that's how they've actually managed to maybe rebuild a part of kayfabe.
And this is why now we live in what we could call a post-kayfabe world.
I think that's exactly correct. I want to go back to a thing that you said before I got really excited to talk about the Montreal Screwjob, which honestly, we could talk about the Montreal Screwjob for an hour. I could talk about it for an hour. I don't know if many people want to hear us talk about that for an hour, but let me just go back to this idea of the referee as representing justice. This idea of justice and good and bad. How does it connect with Quebec right now in particular?
I don't know how it connect with Quebec right now, but it was connecting with Quebec back in the days, like in the maybe 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, because even though French Canadians are not a minority in Quebec. For many years, they were treated as such.
Yeah.
So wrestling was a way like hockey, because when the Montreal Canadiens were winning Stanley Cup.
But many Stanley Cups. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a way for French Canadian to finally win at something. So Maurice Richard was our hero because he was the one who was finally winning at something. He was not badly treated by his boss in the shops, like it was the case with many French Canadians. And that was the same thing that was going on with wrestling. So there's a really famous wrestler called Yvon Robert, was famous during the 40s, 50s, 60s, was a really good friend of Maurice Richard and was as huge in Quebec.
Yeah.
But it was this massive hero for Quebec because he was winning in the ring against Anglos and against all over the world. And finally, French Canadians were good at something and were able to get a win.
So when you think about this now, what do you understand now about Robert Lepage as a theater director, having had this new and pretty intimate understanding of how much wrestling means to him, would you say?
Robert Lepage is this important intellectual, cultural figure in Quebec.
Yeah.
And we thought of him as somebody who's really serious because he's putting on like shows that can last 12 hours sometimes.
Yeah.
He's known internationally.
As serious as it gets when it comes to theater, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So when a guy like him says, I'm into wrestling, this thing that a lot of people still think is dumb or too campy for how serious they think about themselves, it's huge for the wrestling community. So when I was there at the exhibit, it was the opening, and there was a bunch of, maybe you remember Pierre-Carl Ouellet, who was wrestling, PCO was wrestling with Jacques Rougeau, the Quebecers in the 90s in WWF. Yeah. He was there, and a bunch of important figures in the wrestling community in Quebec were there. And for those people, it's unbelievable that a museum as important as Musée de la Civilisation in Quebec will put on this whole exhibit.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful about that thing that for their whole life they've been told is too dumb or like not really important, not culturally important for people who are deciding what's important culture for our province. So I think it's really important for Robert Lepage to talk about wrestling for those reasons, but also for him to deconstruct his image. So I had the chance to spend a day with him, and that man is really, really funny. And
he's not that serious all the time. Yeah.
No. So I think he likes the fact that now wrestling is part of the image we get out of him, and that it kind of deconstruct the self-serious image that we can have of him. Yeah.
I love that because you've just wrapped up so many ideas about the way that wrestling is viewed versus where wrestling really belongs. Because if you are a theater professional, let alone a theater professional with the reputation or the history of Lepage, then you go, my job is to create theater that makes people feel things and move them. And nowhere else do you see this as obviously and as directly as the theater that is created in wrestling. And so I appreciate you shedding light on this exhibit and also bringing your energy and your passion into this, because I truly feel I feel like we could talk about wrestling for another 3 hours, but maybe we should stop here, Dominic. But thank you for being here, man.
We should ask CBC to give us a whole show about wrestling.
I am so ready. Let's go. Anytime you want, let's do this. Dominic
Let's
Tardif,
call the boss.
I appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alan.
Dominic Tardif is a reporter with La Presse. The wrestling exhibit that you just heard about is on until April 20th at the Museum of Civilization in Quebec. Also, if you speak French, you can hear Dominique's full conversation with Robert Lepage on his podcast, Juste Entre Toi et Moi. I also wanted to let you know that this Monday on Commotion, we are going to have like a blow-by-blow of The Rock's return to wrestling, because he's back at WrestleMania 40 this weekend. That is my best approximation of a wrestling voice. That's all you're going to get from me. Hey, I hope that you got a lot out of this conversation. I hope that I didn't reveal myself to be too much of a wrestling nerd. And if you talk to me about it in person, I will absolutely deny it. Listen, I will see you tomorrow. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. My name is Elamine. This is Commotion. Have a great day.